and do a combination of housing and services and jobs in a fairly compact area. When we've seen examples of that in US suburbs, those are really popular. Part of the reason that urbanists push for this kind of development is that we know from prices and rents that that's the kind of development, the kind of neighborhood a lot of people would like to be able to live in. And so we're underbuilding this sort of compact, workable development relative to demand, and in a sense, overbuilding the sprawling separation of uses, which is inexpensive upfront, but has these The subtitle of the book is How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems. And the reason I wrote it is because there are lots of these conversations around housing affordability, housing supply, affordability for poor people, what's working and what's not. But the conversations tend to happen in different silos. And I wanted to help people understand how the pieces of housing markets fit together. Part of the problem with working with complex systems is that you can't change one piece of a system and leave the rest of it alone. So if we think about things like, for instance, building a lot more housing to make entry-level homeownership more affordable, that has implications for the value of homes that people already own, which is their largest source of equity. And so you wind up trying to solve one little piece of the problem and either running into political resistance in other parts of the system or creating downstream impacts that you didn't anticipate.
I always have this very simplistic approach to it. I come from Ireland and that, and I look at the situation there because Ireland was like many European countries. It built a lot of social housing in the early part of the 20th century, and then that social housing stock was sold off. So my argument is always build more social housing. But what you're saying to me is that if you do build more social housing, maybe that's going to have an effect on the price of my parents' home. If eventually they pass away and they leave it to me, so it could actually end up costing me money if I do that.
Just to be aware.
In the US, we don't build a ton of social housing. And so we're mostly talking about housing that is built and owned and operated by the private sector. About 2/3 of American families own their own homes. So that's sort of the bulk of the housing market. And then in the rental sector, most of that is still privately owned and operated. So one thing that we have to grapple with in the US is that the government plays a lot of important roles in sort of writing the rules of the system, but it doesn't directly build or provide funding for or own very much housing. And so the government role is actually fairly constrained relative to a lot of European countries where the government has just a much more front and central role. And so part of the implication of that is that public policies matter, but they have to understand how market forces work, and the policies work best when they are guiding market capital and guiding the actions of market actors, households and companies in ways that they already are leaning towards. It's very hard to come up with policies that really stop the market from acting the way it wants to.
That seems to be a recurring theme in European countries and to a certain extent in many American cities as well. What do you see as the big problems? Because it seems to me that there's a problem with supply in big cities everywhere, in North America, in Australia, in Japan, in Europe. Why is that? Is it because, this like a sort of a false sense of scarcity pushes up the value of these assets, or how does that work?
So we'll start with a little bit of history, of course, sort of the US context, then talk about how relevant that is in other places. The US is in a housing shortage. We know this from research. The estimates of how big the shortages vary, but somewhere around 4 million units nationwide. And if you look at sort of the graph of housing production over a long period of time, you can see that we're sort of building less housing per capita than we used to 40 years ago, but that the real problem starts during the great financial crisis. The US stopped building homes altogether for about 4 or 5 years. We had levels of home building we hadn't seen since the 1930s, just stopped altogether. And it took a very long time to start climbing back up to the levels of production that we were at before the recession. That was a global phenomenon because the sort of the crash in the mortgage markets, the drying up of capital was really important all over the world. Builders couldn't get loans in order to do new housing development, and households couldn't get mortgages in order to buy it, right? So housing markets across the world really just froze for some time, and it took a while to sort of ramp things up again. What seems to be different about sort of the recovery is that we have gotten to kind of sclerotic development patterns in a
Click there. 22222.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
22222. 1 2 1 2
Delay,
1 2. Click there. Yeah. 22222.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
22222.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
1 2 1 2 1 2.
Yep, I've got it.
Yeah, that seems okay.
Yeah, both good.
Okay, should we turn? Okay.